Ara.
Oh, oh, hello. Okay. I will speak Spanish if you don't mind. You will appreciate it. Bien, esta es la...
So we're opening the panel discussion. I hope it's going to be as dynamic and fluid as possible. So I will ask a few questions, but I mean I'm going to be asking you individually, but of course all the questions can be answered by all the speakers. Let me try my best here. So as you've seen, this conference is about gathering professionals from the art world, or not from the art world, but all of us have a common ground, which is our interest in archives. I'm quite satisfied about how things went this morning, and I hope you share my satisfaction. So, my first question is regarding the Bae archive. And Eric Ketelar, and then I have a few questions regarding your presentation this morning, and questions we have long time wished to ask you, and I hope you're gonna welcome our questions. So, first and foremost, in your work, you speak about activation and the different semantic fields of activation: co-authorship, co-creation, the co-creator. You refer to the co-creator often. Could we draw a parallel in art between the co-author and the art piece? You've quoted Duchamp, and Duchamp is a co-creator of an object which started being a masterpiece that evolved over time. The art piece is oftentimes surrounded and is defined by non-artistic elements, but without which art wouldn't exist, or the piece of art would not be considered art. So more than asking you about art archives, I would like to ask you if you could, I mean, if you believe there's a parallel between archives and art in our times, of course, that is.
Well, I think that there is this, at least a parallel, maybe not the same, but a work of art is viewed by the public, by other people than the author. And by viewing, this viewing, I call an activation of both the archival record, but the same for a work of art. And that is the final quote from Duchamp. There's this wonderful philosophical dilemma. If in a wood, in a forest, a tree falls, but there is no one around, does that tree make a sound, a noise? The same applies to a work of art. If an artist is making his or her work and stores it away and never touches it, and turns the key to the cupboard, that is not a work of art. The work of art is not yet finished then, because it is really finished by its activation time and again. And today we see other things in Duchamp's work or in Boltanski's work than he himself or the public at the time of creation thought. So we have to move from the author as the only important person in the whole process to a notion of co-creatorship, either by the public or by any archiver if it goes on archive, if it is an archival document. So that's the wonderful thing about this conference, but this gathering that from these different fields people are coming together and exchange information. We have to learn to speak each other's language, because as I hope to make clear, originally an archive, my archive was something else than the archive of other people. But so we have to exchange also the different views and the different professional languages, professional experiences to really take further steps forward.
So I'm going to skip the order now of interventions. Laura, in your case, you also speak about co-creation and documents activation. I will dig in a little bit regarding the topic. You've had very little time for your presentation. Would you like to elaborate on the previous question? So first of all, as we all know, in our field, we do not speak about authors. An archive is not considered a creation, even though we have one or several authors. Well, in our case, we have two authors, Bernard Hayes and then Brigitte Bars. But at the same time, in the very same document, there's a switch of meaning. Semantically speaking, the meaning is different with the second author. So there are other examples. Sometimes the author is the author of the archive as well. Brigitte Bayer writes in the published catalogs, and then they become archival documents. She is a co-author, one could say. Nuria, I don't know if you would like to elaborate, but there's no doubt about the importance of co-creation. In any case, you coincide in saying that, you agree in saying that archives are considered the end of the cycle, the closing of the loop, as Eric mentioned before, like they are considered like the end of the life of a document, when in fact it's completely the other way around. It's an early beginning, actually. Archives are the beginning of a new life for a document, for any document archived. Absolutely, I believe Nuria mentioned this. David Leclerc, the donor, his aim was precisely to ensure that the archive was always ready to become something different. So the donor had this will. So yeah, he succeeded in his.
Is expanding. So the boundaries are not fixed, but for every time a new material will be added to this whole conglomerate, in fact, of what is the archive in a very extended sense.
Totalmente.
Pues Laura, yo te miro.
Laura, I don't know, where should I look to say? Oh, there. So I would like to underline your defense of the role of archive professionals in the digital era, in the era of groundbreaking technologies, which are sometimes troublesome, as you say. I would like to ask you a question, considering that we are here amongst different professionals. So to what extent do artists and archive professionals share common elements, considering that they somehow define something as being true? A Picasso painting, of course, is signed by Picasso's signature. A document from the 17th century is marked with a stamp, right, or with a certain methodology. Can we draw a parallel there, especially in today's world, where documents, let's say, are gaining more and more importance in art? So this would be my question. I hope it's clear. I have a second one, but could you do you think there's a parallel between archive professionals and artists? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gracias. I think it's a fascinating and challenging question. I would love to think of archivists as artists. Makes me feel very special. Uh, I do believe there is a co-creation process, as Eric talks about. But the work in archives is not mine. I am the helper, just as a lawyer helps argue a case. A judge helps decide the case. The judge does not make the case. I think the best parallel I might offer is with doctors and the medical professionals. We don't try to help people stay healthy because it matters to us. We try to help them stay healthy because it matters to them. So that has to be defined in their own terms. I like to eat salad. You might not like salad, but salad is good for you. I might say eat salad. Um, the artist makes a work, and the truth of that work, the personal truth, is what does the artist want to create? The evidential truth is, can we know that that artist made that work and has the right and the privilege of claiming the authorship? What I was able to get up early enough to listen to, not to Eric, I'm sorry, but to the other two presentations. And I think the question of co-creatorship and the role of the archivist is one that we've all touched on. And the idea to me is that we do this in the service of society, not just the artist and not just the creator of records, which means sometimes we make decisions that are not because we want those records to exist, but because we need them to exist. And that's where I think there's a bit of a difference. The artist chooses. We choose on the basis of what is going to help our society be honest about itself. I'll stop there so we can carry on.
A una pregunta.
Okay, let me ask a second, less good question. I would like to ask you, considering that you work in the field you work, I would like to ask you about NFTs and the new authentication ways to authenticate digital art pieces as being unique with this digital stamp or digital label. What is your opinion on these new forms of authentication?
Thank you, gracias. I think the technology is fabulous and fascinating, and we should continue to pursue this. I think it has great benefit for archives. One of my friends and colleagues, Peter Van Garderen, who developed some fabulous software for archival description and management, is now working on blockchain technology to capture land records so that people, particularly in less resourced parts of the world, can prove their rights to land, because from rights to land come things like obtaining mortgages, obtaining loans, being able to become a more productive member of the society. The tools such as blockchain, crypto technologies are a fabulous support for this, and archivists should be very much involved in this, not to be computer programmers, but to layer in to the technology development the recognition that there is an evidential component to this. To every technology, there is a role of, are we trying to protect a piece of proof? And how do we protect that piece of proof? And how will that technology or system work to best effect? So I really want to see us directly involved in that process. But I don't want us to think it's us alone that have to do this. We cannot do this alone. We have to insert our perspective into the work of others. And I think this means we have to look away from the management of the aggregate of the collection once it arrives in our institution to how do we influence the creation of the record, like Eric, creation of the piece of art, talking about the co-creatorship in this case, is us saying whatever you make as a record, as a piece of evidence, how do we know it's going to sustain, not just for a week, but for as long as we think permanent might be. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Hay una pregunta que voy a hacer.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. I have another question. We're speaking about activations, and one of the activations, one of the most visible activations in the case of archives, are exhibitions. And this symposium is entitled Archiving and Exhibiting. Now, here comes a general question and then a question for Michael. The general question goes, and it's a personal concern of mine, are there too many documents, exhibitions out there, and very little archivistic exhibitions? Are archives, I mean, are archives to be exhibited and not so much to speak about, I don't know, Isabel the Catholic? This would be the first question, and then the second one for Michael, so that Michael can think about his answer. But the question is for all of you, in case you would like to answer it.
Are you prepared to take the lead?
I can say the first. I can try to. I think it, in some ways, goes along the line with what Eric said about the artist's work being locked away and not seen. It's the same for me with archives. There doesn't seem to be much of a real point for the public of an archive if we're not showing it and if it's not seen. And the majority of the public, despite the fact that the archive will in some ways connect to them, don't visit archives and don't see what's inside of them. So the opportunity to present the public with the archival material, I think, is extremely important, and to make these vast vaults of material that are sort of locked away in museums accessible to people, and to even at a previous exhibition, opening up the boxes we did with a group of that I worked with at the Van Abbe Museum, showing the boxes themselves and having tours come in and opening up the boxes and letting people see what is even inside of these, what's inside of an archival box, what's inside a folder, what is, you know, people might have a perception of what is an archive, but to actually see inside of one is not something that everyone does. So to open that up, to allow museum visitors to see, okay, so this is what it looks like when an archive is stacked in a row, and inside each one, this is what you can expect to find. I think the ability to do that for a museum is extremely important, and to at any time there's an opportunity to bring people into the archive and understand what it means, I think is important.
Well, now there are now so many archives being digitized and put on the internet, and it is wonderful, especially in the pandemic period, that you can just from your home access any archive in the world. Maybe it would be an idea to refigure the internet presentation in such a way that you first have a short introduction as a viewer, that you see what the archive, in fact, in its material shape, in the boxes and in the long shelves, look like, and then move on to on the micro level, the single document. So make it, I think, archivists could do more, as you said, in exhibiting, in fact, not so much the single document, but the archive a whole.
It would
And
show the context better
Yeah,
as well
yeah.
if you saw everything else
yeah.
and not just individual
Yeah.
pieces from an archive.
But in the old days, I mean, the main advantage, I think, for the user of archives over someone visiting an exhibition in a museum, that you could really touch the material. You could put your fingers on it, and you would have the letter by Napoleon in your hands, not in a glass case of an exhibition. Now, with the digital archives and digital objects, this is changing, but we haven't yet found, I think, a means to make clear to the user what is really behind this facade where you enter the archives and then you ask for the box and you get the box on your table.
¿Podría ser lo que habéis mostrado el guión para una exposición?
Could this be the script for an exhibition? Sorry, I didn't get the question. No, it wasn't for Laura, it was for you. So what you have described is not a historical journey in the Bayer. No, well, actually, we've discussed about this many times. My answer to all your questions is yes, yes, and yes. I believe there are quite many archives exhibitions with archive documents, but not about archives. There are different ways of approaching this. With Bayer, we had an exhibition last summer with the aim of precisely narrating the process, the creation process. Because when you speak about the process, you speak about the content implicitly. And as you said before, this is what historiography is about. It's not so much about the graphic work, Picasso's graphic work, but rather how we work from an archive perspective, because this is what we can have access to, right? It's not easy. And when we say there's a lack of audience, it's not true. This summer we had two exhibitions, one by Brigitte Barr, The Creation Factory. It was very archivistic. It was like a process lab. It included even the document, and then another exhibition, a photography exhibition. It was much more successful, and it's being exhibited here in the at the Picasso. But in any case, I believe that it's not easy to organize an archives exhibition. Well, what I believe is that what tends to happen is that documents have to be at the service of a superior cause. Sometimes, in the case of Bayer, I believe we managed to exhibit an archive and not a document, and this is quite rare. And I believe it's, another interesting approach. It's not an historical narrative from outside the archive, but rather you speak about the very archive. And I would like to say also regarding your previous question on whether archivists can be compared with artists, I believe that we all have a creative vocation. Nonetheless, artists use the poetic theater of language, whereas us don't. So even if we are all creative, creativity is much more complex than that. In many jobs, humankind creates, otherwise it would be super boring. But artists, they use the poetic functionality of language, whereas in archives we shall not use poetry, even if we are first-hand authors.
Tiene que ver.
This has to do with Laura. Laura.
No, es que cuando tú no estabas.
Well, when you were not here, well, we could see you, but you were not here. I talked to the end of your presentation, I talked about the way you were finishing your presentation. If I find it, I will let you know. My goal as an archivist is to ensure that our artifice is used in the service of art, not archives. I don't know whether you understood that correctly. My English is not too good, but anyway, what I meant to say with that is that what Nodia was saying is very much linked to the ends of your presentation, which is very poetical. The eternal debate, I'm not going to ask anything you haven't said already, but I would like for you to elaborate more on that. The fact that archivists don't hold the truth is something that we have all assumed, that is already known. The truth is not or does not lie in the archive, but it could seem at some point in your presentation that there is a certain approach to that principle or claim. Please tell me otherwise if that is not the case.
Thank you. If the question is there a art in archives? Absolutely. We create, we choose, we select. When we are doing that, it should be in the service of proof. And from that, people can create their own truth. They can take many pieces of evidence and triangulate and use those different pieces of evidence to say, from this, I can come up with a whole. It's not a whole, but it's close to a whole. So we are active creators of what society remembers. We are artists. I don't think we use the language. I think we are afraid as a profession to go outside of the box. I don't think we should be afraid. I think we should say, I am here actively engaging and making decisions that influence what we will know in the future. What concerns me is when we place ourselves at the center of that decision-making process. I will keep this because I think it's important to me. We have to be thinking, what is society going to learn from all of the decisions that we make and all the materials that we select and leave behind? So we are not a science. Many people argue we are. I do not believe we are. But I think we have an obligation to be honest and transparent in the approach to our work and to say, I am creating the evidence upon which we seek our memories. And then what I want to see is for us to work with the public so that they realize what we're doing and they participate actively and don't leave the decisions to us alone. And to go back to the previous discussion then, should we be exhibiting? Absolutely. I will speak heresy here. I think we should have children in the archives. I think we should have people working with materials when they are young. I have said to many people, I would not have fights in the boardroom about the value of archives if those chief executive officers had been exposed to archives when they were 4 years old. They would understand. Thanks.
Gracias.
Thank you. I'm not too sure how we're doing with time.
Yes.
Yes. Wait a moment. The
Wait for the
microphone.
mic.
for the translation for the translators. Thank you.
I think it's very important what you said, but wouldn't it be more productive, instead of saying archivists are also artists, that archivists have a kind of political responsibility? Because so far we have not talked about power and politics, but in fact, I think what you were arguing, especially in relation to society and how archivists in a way are responsible for future memory, and I think that's not so much an artistic responsibility, but a political responsibility.
Gracias.
Thank you.
I think that's an excellent point.
Sí, pero preguntaba por el tiempo.
I was asking about the time. Can someone tell me, please, how we're doing with time? I think we have around 15 minutes left.
Just to prolong what you said, I was very shocked that you said archivistic is not a science. And it's and for me it's too easy, because we know that social science are update. They are the science of our moment, our present. Like archivistic has own history, and this is one of the most interesting things that happen in archivistic field, is the emergence of an history of the act of archiving, and I don't understand why you oppose, as you say, science and art. Artists are responsible. For me, you are a writer, you are a painter, you are responsible. You are not. You have to. You cannot say anything.
Perhaps I can answer it. In English, it's very important to make a difference between science and scholarship, and all the interpretive disciplines. Interpretive disciplines are not sciences, and I think it is very important that Laura emphasizes the fact that as an archivist you are interpreting all the time. In that sense, it is not a science, indeed.
I think,
well, yes, there is this eternal misunderstanding between Americans on the one, or North Americans on the one hand, and Europeans on the other hand. Science in our European context is the German Wissenschaft, and that's something else than the hard science like chemistry and physics. I would like to come back to what Ernst said, and in fact Philippe too. Also, the archivist is a political figure in the sense that he or she is making decisions which have effect on society. But the same is with an artist, especially an artist in the context of the museum environment. Any exhibition of art objects is a political statement, because some items have been discarded, other items are never shown. This is politics with a big P. Well, again, of course, Jacques Derrida has also commented on that, but we should forget, politics is not something, well, in the hands of politicians, it is a dirty job. But in the hands of archivists and artists, politics is a very good thing. It is the bread and butter of our profession, which I call, by the way, archivistics, to avoid this archival science discussion, the science discussion.
Muy bien. Se extiende.
Okay, so we're getting warmer here. All right. this involves, I don't know whether, oh yeah, he's here. He's here. He's the one who spoke. Okay. There is a thing here related. Well, I know that archivers I know, they don't like the fact that archival science is a narrative, but the truth is that the presence of archives in art has built an archive narrative. And in his book, Nanau Pen talks about the disappearance of narrative in the favor of the database and the Lermanovich theories. I wanted to ask you all in the room, now that we are all here chatting away, if we're talking about whether this presence in the world of archival science has constructed another narrative, or is it doing away or getting rid of the narrative we are used to? I would say that it has built or constructed a different type of narrative more than having it eliminated. But this is a question I just launched to you all.
Correct you a little bit. I never said that that narrative is eliminated. I argued in my book that narrative has for a long time, centuries long, been the most symbolic mode, and perhaps now the archive has become a more important a symbolic mode, but it does not mean that narrative has been, or the importance of narrative has been eliminated. No, not at all.
Okay. Okay. To Eric.
Okay, Eric, in your presentation, you say that the practice and theory of art rarely deal with the sub-products of creative activities, such as the documents that represent the transactional relationships of artists, commissions, letters, financial statements, patrons, so the documents of the artist, in other words. In all the 20th century, these documents have become integrated in the performances, and there's a case I briefly explained, the case of the sale of, he explained the material sensibility. He's selling air, and there is a notary public there, and there is a gallery owner. So should we favor that these activities, these transactions that you mention, were more deeply studied as an art archive more than the metaphorical way of seeing it?
For an artist, the primary archive is his or her works. But in order to understand more about the environment in which the artist created that work of art, I think access to his or her records, financial statements, correspondence, and we have heard a number of examples where it's luckily the archives of the artist have been preserved. Of course, it is on a large scale. I mean, we don't have, from Rembrandt, there are roughly 600 documents about Rembrandt. We have only 7 letters of Rembrandt written by himself. Are we now in a position to really say something truthful about Rembrandt? Well, it depends on whether you are an art lover or you're an archivist. I would plead for preserving the records, because it is a paradox. The artist is making an archive art. Boltanski is making is planning his installation. But in that, the planning itself is a process, a work process, which leaves a sediment in the form of records. These should be kept too, because they could supplement our understanding of the artist from the work of art only. We could supplement it by financial records, correspondence, and the like. And I really like Michael's expansion of the archives of in this case a museum, but the same applies, of course, to individual artists. That you shouldn't have a very narrow description of what constitutes the archive, but you should include his or her contemporaries. Many of those are of installation artists, or many artists use craftsmen to help them in producing, creating the work of art. In many cases, these craftsmen, the carpenter who made the scaffold for the sculptor, they are forgotten. But there has been a contract between those craftsmen and the artist. So it is a much more integral approach of what constitutes an artist's archive.
Totalmente de acuerdo.
Yes, we agree.
May I add to that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, Michael.
No, go ahead.
I just want to say, let us think about the impact of Eric's words in the digital age. There may only be 7 letters by Rembrandt, by an artist, but there are other materials about him. They are not considered traditionally his archives. Today, if I walk down the street, GPS data is tracking me, closed circuit cameras are recording me, and that information is being used to affect my life. Is it my archives? Traditionally, no. But I think we have to rethink that, because we are being documented with or without our consent in many, many ways that are outside of our control, by automation, by other organizations, by other people. And I think the archivist has a role to play in saying, look at how we are creating and capturing the evidence of ourselves. And how is it being used? And what do we need to preserve that is my archives? Because my archives is no longer by me or of me. It can be about me. Thanks.
Michael quería hablar.
I think Michael wanted to say something.
Just for me, it was a similar idea. It was the expansion of this archive was because I was hitting dead ends for what constituted his archive, and wanted to see, yes, in a more analog sense, for someone that lived 100 years ago, what else could we say includes his archive, and where else could we find it, and where are the other traces where it's not by him or even about him, but tangentially it connects to him, and finding these traces and continuing these different threads, and where I could find him, and building an archive about a person, only to discover in the end that in his grandson's attic there was something that you could just say was his archive, but by expanding it, it felt like more context was being given to that sort of official archive of Henri was also in what I could grow around a person. So I felt the act of expanding an archive and growing an archive of a person was beneficial to then the context of what arrived at the museum in the end.
Yo quería comentar una.
I wanted to comment one thing, Jorge, if I may. I think they both mentioned it in the case of Picasso, the artist. We don't have Pablo Picasso's archive in the museum. It is in Paris. And now I thought about once when some of his sons said, well, I believe that people believe Pablo Picasso is what lies in his archive. And, well, we talk about Picasso, but we don't have it here. We don't have his archive here. But, of course, whatever word we want to use, it makes us think of him, because at the end of the day, we talk about archives of artists. But regarding what Michael was saying now, it is not the artist's archive. It's much more. It is a series of connections and links, and that's what can bring us closer to the artist at the end of the day. And I believe that that is crucial. And in the case of Pablo Picasso, for instance, he frequently answered the phone. He didn't reply in writing. So in this case, letters maybe or could not be as significant. So I think it's a case-by-case thing, and I think this cosmology is very important, not only analyzing the artist's archive. Yes, and to what extent working with archives relating to an author is building the perspective on that author. Well, I think it is building quite a lot. Apart from everything surrounding, of course, yes, this is very much related to the comments I made of Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso kept a lot. This is what they say. I have seen the archive, but he kept everything, the tickets for this and for that. That's what we think. We think he kept everything, but it's not sure. And the fact that his own son made this comment of saying, well, people just think that this is Pablo Picasso, and that's not the case. But beyond the fact that that is not the case, we see that with no doubt we have this representation of the character, and that may not be real. In this case, it's not the artist, it's rigid bias. Sometimes we speak about her as if we know her, and we know her work through that. So yes, I believe it does condition quite a lot. Michael had a question for you a long time ago, but you've spoken about community and archive. Well, this is not specifically what you talked about, but you have worked a lot on community appraisal and, well, community documentary appraisal. So what place can it have in collecting otherwise when it comes to selecting or organizing and disseminating that community appraisal that so many authors have been working on?
A large role. The project that we're working on with Collecting Otherwise is involving a network organization. So they're both a archives creator, but also a community. But then the community is also much larger than just this group that is sort of the official group. But within that group, there are multiple members who are becoming part of the appraisal process and part of this, like I mentioned, also a sort of expanded creation process as well, because part of the appraisal has been to visit the individual donors, to work with them, to bring them together and build that timeline, and to create even more records, but to make sure that they're involved in that process and to invite them in for the interviews, and to ensure that this community organization or this network group is involved in appraisal of their archive, since it is their archive in the end.
Laura? Between analog archive science and what we're living now, which is the technological one, what has been lost for the user? Or stated otherwise, archival science continues to be a strange landscape for the user, and it seems like we have not managed to bring the poetry and the political side of archival science to the user or the citizen itself. So what has happened in that in-between part that may have been lost, if there's anything, in your opinion?
Question. Thank you. I'd turn the question on its head a bit. I would ask, what has been lost because we don't carve clay tablets anymore? Do we have any idea? We never did it. I never did it. So I don't know. I am in that netherland of digital immigrants. I was not born into the technology, and I feel there's a lot lost because I know what it's like to touch and feel a 17th century document. But I don't know what my nieces or my lovely grandniece living in Germany will know. She's 9 years old. She may never, ever experience that physical, tactile experience. But she's going to experience something very, very different, and that will be her reality. The challenge with the archivist is not to try to, it's ironic, we preserve the evidence of the past, but we can't hold on to the technologies of the past in order to do that. We need to keep moving and changing in order to preserve that which is being created by society at the moment. So I would say, yes, much is lost for those of us living this transition, but so much is gained if we open ourselves up to what can this technology do for me, and what do I need to do to protect myself from the excesses or dangers that it brings. Thanks.
Gracias.
No sé si hay las preguntas.
I think Deborah has a question. Deborah, we have a wireless mic ready for you.
The last point. Do you think there is a different type of archive? I mean, the archive that are related to documents of the last decades and the new archive. From my point of view, for instance, for the archive of the Biennale, we have an archive of the past editions that are documents, papers, photos, printed photos, and nowadays it's very different to build the archive of the current exhibitions because everything is online, is emails, WhatsApp. We have documents that arrive via WhatsApp, and so it's something completely different. So, for instance, we asked our directors to try to collect the most significant correspondence via email that they receive with the artist. But it's something very, very different. For the past documents, I think that it's important to preserve it's okay, the digitalization, the fact that we have new technologies, but the contact with documents, we cannot take it away, because also in the examine, the way that documents are collected, that is something that is useful to the researcher, because you know that if that document is in a particular folder, that means something maybe for the research. And this is crucial for that type of documents and archive. But the new archive, as Laura said, is something very, very different. And so maybe the new technologies are useful for that new kind of documentation. But that type of documentation needs procedures and specific procedures. Anyway, we lost a lot of useful information.
Shall I try to answer, or with my opinion? I mean, there are two things here. One is appraisal, and the other is use or access. Appraisal, very recently, the National Archives Administration of the United States has issued a new policy declaring text messages and other social media used by federal officers in the United States, that they are records in the meaning of the records legislation. But they have said, no, we will apply what they call the capstone policy to include messages, text messages, etc. The capstone meaning that in each agency of the federal government of the United States, they have identified what are the capstone officers in that particular agency. So they don't keep everything, but they keep only, or they appraise as worthwhile only the capstone messages. Now, the use of this digital material, of course, it entails a totally new approach by researchers and by archivists. But by researchers, they were accustomed, as you said, in having the folder and taking the document out of the folder, and the folder is part of a series, and that series is part of the archive. Now we have to rethink these researcher strategies and making them digital proof, as it were. And we are still in the process of finding out, together with researchers and digital experts, how can that work. So I'm convinced that in a few years' time we will have a totally new research environment than at present, where still many archival institutions, many archivists just think that the methods which were valid yesterday are valid today. No, that's not the case. We have to design new methodologies for using and appraising digital records.
Very bold statement in the sense that perhaps we should stop talking about archives and replace that term by archival practices. And that, I think, also solves your problem, but also a lot of the discussion was about are archivists also artists, or are they creative? No, we should just compare the archival practice of an archivist with the archival practice of an artist, for instance. That makes it much easier. What they have in common and how do they differ? And another issue, also one of your questions was, is it possible to put the, in a way, the file cabinet or the box from the archive into an exhibition? I think we should acknowledge that that exhibition spaces or museums are also, in a way, archival. It's another archival genre as the old institutional archive as it was established in the 19th century. So then again, it's not so the question. We start too often our discussions with the old institutional archive as it was established in the 19th century. And there are many more archival practices, and I think it's much more productive to acknowledge that, and then it becomes possible to compare them. Mm. Mm-hmm.
Parece que se nos acaba el tiempo.
I think we're running out of time. Let's see if we have any online question. No. No online questions. So thank you very much.
Yeah. He's the screen.
He has the people.
No, they are all. Laura, do you have lunch? Are you in?
No. I think it's
5:30 in the morning.
Breakfast.
Laura,
I still have
ciao.
a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Bye.